The Curse of the Golden Cross. By G.K. Chesterton. 6 people sat round a small table, seeming almost as incongruous and accidental as if they had been shipwrecked separately on the same small desert island. At least the sea surrounded them, for in one sense their island was enclosed in another island, a large and flying island like Laputa. For the little table was one of many little tables dotted about in the dining saloon of that monstrous ship the Moravia, speeding through the night and the everlasting emptiness of the Atlantic. The little company had nothing in common except that all were travelling from America to England. 2 of them at least might be called celebrities, others might be called obscure, and in 1 or 2 cases even dubious. The first was the famous Professor Smoul, an authority on certain archaeological studies touching the later Byzantine Empire. His lectures, delivered in an American university, were accepted as of the first authority even in the most authoritative seats of learning in Europe. His literary works were so steeped in a mellow and imaginative sympathy with the European past, that it often gave strangers a start to hear him speak with an American accent. Yet he was, in his way, very American. He had long fair hair brushed back from a big square forehead, long straight features and a curious mixture of preoccupation with a poise of potential swiftness, like a lion pondering absent-mindedly on his next leap. There was only one lady in the group, and she was, as the journalists often said of her, a host in herself, being quite prepared to play hostess, not to say empress, at that or any other table. She was Lady Diana Wales, the celebrated lady traveller in tropical and other countries, but there was nothing rugged or masculine about her appearance at dinner. She was herself handsome in an almost tropical fashion, with a mass of hot and heavy red hair. She was dressed in what the journalists call a daring fashion, but her face was intelligent and her eyes had that bright and rather prominent appearance which belongs to the eyes of ladies who ask questions at political meetings. The other 4 figures seemed at first like shadows in this shining presence, but they showed differences on a close view. One of them was a young man entered on the ship's register as Paul T. Tarrant. He was an American type which might be more truly called an American antitype. Every nation probably has an antitype, a sort of extreme exception that proves the national rule. Americans really respect work, rather as Europeans respect war. There is a halo of heroism about it, and he who shrinks from it is less than a man. The antitype is evident through being exceedingly rare. He is the dandy or dude, the wealthy waster who makes a weak villain for so many American novels. Paul Tarrant seemed to have nothing whatever to do but change his clothes, which he did about 6 times a day, passing into paler or richer shades of his suit of exquisite light grey, like the delicate silver changes of the twilight. Unlike most Americans, he cultivated very carefully a short, curly beard, and unlike most dandies, even of his own type, he seemed rather sulky than showy. Perhaps there was something almost Byronic about his silence and his gloom. The next 2 travellers were naturally classed together, merely because they were both English lecturers returning from an American tour. One of them was described as Leonard Smith, apparently a minor poet, but something of a major journalist, long-headed, light-haired, perfectly dressed, and perfectly capable of looking after himself. The other was a rather comic contrast, being short and broad, with a black, walrus moustache, and as taciturn as the other was talkative. But as he had been both charged with robbing and praised for rescuing a Romanian princess threatened by a jaguar in his travelling menagerie, and had thus figured in a fashionable case, it was naturally felt that his views on God, progress, his own early life, and the future of Anglo-American relations would be of great interest and value to the inhabitants of Minneapolis and Omaha. The 6th and most insignificant figure was that of a little English priest going by the name of Brown. He listened to the conversation with respectful attention, and he was at that moment forming the impression that there was one rather curious thing about it. "I suppose those Byzantine studies of yours, Professor," Leonard Smith was saying, "would throw some light on this story of a tomb found somewhere on the south coast, near Brighton, isn't it? Brighton's a long way from Byzantium, of course. But I read something about the style of burying or embalming or something being supposed to be Byzantine." "Byzantine studies certainly have to reach a long way," replied the professor dryly. "They talk about specialists, but I think the hardest thing on earth is to specialize. In this case, for instance, how can a man know anything about Byzantium till he knows everything about Rome before it and about Islam after it? Most Arab arts were old Byzantine arts. Why, take algebra." "But I won't take algebra," cried the lady decisively. "I never did, and I never do. But I'm awfully interested in embalming. I was with Gatton, you know, when he opened the Babylonian tombs. Ever since then I found mummies and preserved bodies and all that perfectly thrilling. Do tell us about this one." "Gatton was an interesting man," said the professor. "They were an interesting family. That brother of his who went into Parliament was much more than an ordinary politician. I never understood the fascisti till he made that speech about Italy." "Well, we're not going to Italy on this trip," said Lady Diana persistently, "and I believe you are going to that little place where they've found the tomb. In Sussex, isn't it?" "Sussex is pretty large, as these little English sections go," replied the professor. "One might wander about in it for a goodish time, and it's a good place to wander in. It's wonderful how large those low hills seem when you're on them. There was an abrupt accidental silence, and then the lady said, "Oh, I'm going on deck," and rose, the men rising with her. But the professor lingered and the little priest was the last to leave the table, carefully folding up his napkin. And as they were thus left alone together, the professor said suddenly to his companion, "What would you say was the point of that little talk?" "Well," said Father Brown, smiling, "since you ask me, there was something that amused me a little. I may be wrong, but it seemed to me that the company made 3 attempts to get you to talk about an embalmed body said to be found in Sussex. And you, on your side, very courteously offered to talk, first about algebra, and then about the fascisti, and then about the landscape of the Downs. In short," replied the professor, "you thought I was ready to talk about any subject but that one. You were quite right." The professor was silent for a little time, looking down at the tablecloth, then he looked up and spoke with that swift impulsiveness that suggested the lion's leap. "See here, Father Brown," he said, "I consider you about the wisest and whitest man I ever met." Father Brown was very English. He had all the normal national helplessness about what to do with a serious and sincere compliment suddenly handed to him to his face in the American manner. His reply was a meaningless murmur, and it was the professor who proceeded, with the same staccato earnestness. "You see, up to a point it's all simple enough. A Christian tomb of the Dark Ages, apparently that of a bishop, has been found under a little church at Dulham on the Sussex coast. The vicar happens to be a good bit of an archaeologist himself and has been able to find a good deal more than I know yet. There was a rumor of the corpse being embalmed in a way peculiar to Greeks and Egyptians but unknown in the West, especially at that date. So Mr. Walters, that is the vicar, naturally wonders about Byzantine influences. But he also mentions something else, that is of even more personal interest to me." His long grave face seemed to grow even longer and graver as he frowned down at the tablecloth. His long fingers seemed to be tracing patterns on it like the plans of dead cities and their temples and tombs. "So I'm going to tell you, and nobody else, why it is I have to be careful about mentioning that matter in mixed company, and why, the more eager they are to talk about it, the more cautious I have to be. It is also stated that in the coffin is a chain with a cross, common enough to look at, but with a certain secret symbol on the back found on only one other cross in the world. It is from the arcana of the very earliest church, and is supposed to indicate Saint Peter setting up his see at Antioch before he came to Rome. Anyhow, I believe there is but one other like it, and it belongs to me. I hear there is some story about a curse on it, but I take no notice of that. But whether or no there is a curse, there really is, in one sense, a conspiracy, though the conspiracy should only consist of one man." "Of one man?" repeated Father Brown almost mechanically. "Of one madman, for all I know," said Professor Smuggel. "It's a long story and in some ways a silly one." He paused again, tracing plans like architectural drawings with his finger on the cloth, and then resumed. "Perhaps I had better tell you about it from the beginning, in case you see some little point in the story that is meaningless to me. It began years and years ago, when I was conducting some investigations on my own account in the antiquities of Crete and the Greek islands. I did a great deal of it practically single-handed, sometimes with the most rude and temporary help from the inhabitants of the place, and sometimes literally alone. It was under the latter circumstances that I found a maze of subterranean passages which led at last to a heap of rich refuse, broken ornaments and scattered gems which I took to be the ruins of some sunken altar, and in which I found the curious gold cross. I turned it over, and on the back of it I saw the ichthys or fish, which was an early Christian symbol, but of a shape and pattern rather different from that commonly found, and, as it seemed to me, more realistic, more as if the archaic designer had meant it to be not merely a conventional enclosure or nimbus, but to look a little more like a real fish. It seemed to me that there was a flattening towards one end of it that was not like mere mathematical decoration, but rather like a sort of rude or even savage zoology. In order to explain very briefly why I thought this find important, I must tell you the point of the excavation. For one thing, it had something of the nature of an excavation of an excavation. We were on the track not only of antiquities, but of the antiquarians of antiquity. We had reason to believe, or some of us thought we had reason to believe, that these underground passages, mostly of the Minoan period, like that famous one which is actually identified with the labyrinth of the Minotaur, had not really been lost and left undisturbed for all the ages between the Minotaur and the modern explorer. We believed that these underground places, I might almost say these underground towns and villages, had already been penetrated during the intervening period by some persons prompted by some motive. About the motive there were different schools of thought, some holding that the emperors had ordered an official exploration out of mere scientific curiosity, others that the furious fashion in the later Roman Empire for all sorts of lurid Asiatic superstitions had started some nameless Manichaean sect or other rioting in the caverns and orgies that had to be hidden from the face of the sun. I belonged to the group which believed that these caverns had been used in the same way as the catacombs. That is, we believed that, during some of the persecutions which spread like a fire over the whole empire, the Christians had concealed themselves in these ancient pagan labyrinths of stone. It was therefore with a thrill as sharp as a thunderclap that I found and picked up the fallen golden cross and saw the design upon it, and it was with still more of a shock of felicity that, On turning to make my way once more outwards and upwards into the light of day, I looked up at the walls of bare rock that extended endlessly along the low passages, and saw scratched in yet ruder outline, but if possible more unmistakable, the shape of the fish. Something about it made it seem as if it might be a fossil fish or some rudimentary organism fixed forever in a frozen sea. I could not analyze this analogy, otherwise unconnected with a mere drawing scratched upon the stone, till I realized that I was saying in my subconscious mind that the first Christians must have seemed something like fish, dumb and dwelling in a fallen world of twilight and silence, dropped far below the feet of men and moving in dark and twilight in a soundless world. Everyone walking along stone passages knows what it is to be followed by phantom feet. The echo follows flapping or clapping behind or in front, so that it is almost impossible for the man who is really lonely to believe in his loneliness. I had got used to the effects of this echo and had not noticed it much for some time past, when I caught sight of the symbolical shape scrawled on the wall of rock. I stopped, and at the same instant it seemed as if my heart stopped, too, for my own feet had halted, but the echo went marching on. I ran forward, and it seemed as if the ghostly footsteps ran also, but not with that exact imitation which marks the material reverberation of a sound. I stopped again, and the steps stopped also, but I could have sworn they stopped an instant too late. I called out a question, and my cry was answered, but the voice was not my own. It came round the corner of a rock just in front of me, and throughout that uncanny chase I noticed that it was always at some such angle of the crooked path that it paused and spoke. The little space in front of me that could be illuminated by my small electric torch was always as empty as an empty room. Under these conditions I had a conversation with I know not whom, which lasted all the way to the first white gleam of daylight, and even there I could not see in what fashion he vanished into the light of day. But the mouth of the labyrinth was full of many openings and cracks and chasms, and it would not have been difficult for him to have somehow darted back and disappeared again into the underworld of the caves. I only know that I came out on the lonely steps of a great mountain like a marble terrace, varied only with a green vegetation that seemed somehow more tropical than the purity of the rock, like the oriental invasion that has spread sporadically over the fall of classic Hellas. I looked out on a sea of stainless blue, and the sun shone steadily on utter loneliness and silence, and there was not a blade of grass stirred with a whisper of flight nor the shadow of a shadow of man. It had been a terrible conversation, so intimate and so individual and in a sense so casual. This being, bodiless, faceless, nameless and yet calling me by my name, had talked to me in those crypts and cracks where we were buried alive with no more passion or melodrama than if we had been sitting in 2 armchairs at a club. But he had told me also that he would unquestionably kill me or any other man who came into the possession of the cross with the mark of the fish. He told me frankly he was not fool enough to attack me there in the labyrinth, knowing I had a loaded revolver, and that he ran as much risk as I. But he told me, equally calmly, that he would plan my murder with the certainty of success, with every detail developed and every danger warded off, with the sort of artistic perfection that a Chinese craftsman or an Indian embroiderer gives to the artistic work of a lifetime. Yet he was no Oriental. I am certain he was a white man. I suspect that he was a countryman of my own. Since then I have received from time to time signs and symbols and queer impersonal messages that have made me certain, at least, that if the man is a maniac he is a monomaniac. He is always telling me, in this airy and detached way, that the preparations for my death and burial are proceeding satisfactorily, and that the only way in which I can prevent their being crowned with a comfortable success is to give up the relic in my possession, the unique cross that I found in the cavern. He does not seem to have any religious sentiment or fanaticism on the point. He seems to have no passion but the passion of a collector of curiosities. That is one of the things that makes me feel sure he is a man of the West and not of the East. But this particular curiosity seems to have driven him quite crazy. And then came this report, as yet unsubstantiated, about the duplicate relic found on an embalmed body in a Sussex tomb. If he had been a maniac before, this news turned him into a demoniac possessed of 7 devils. That there should be one of them belonging to another man was bad enough, but that there should be 2 of them and neither belonging to him was a torture not to be borne. His mad messages began to come thick and fast like showers of poisoned arrows, and each cried out more confidently than the last that death would strike me at the moment when I stretched out my unworthy hand towards the cross in the tomb. "You will never know me," he wrote, "you will never say my name, you will never see my face, you will die, and never know who has killed you. I may be in any form among those about you, but I shall be in that alone at which you have forgotten to look." From those threats I deduce that he is quite likely to shadow me on this expedition, and try to steal the relic or do me some mischief for possessing it. But as I never saw the man in my life, he may be almost any man I meet. Logically speaking, he may be any of the waiters who wait on me at table. He may be any of the passengers who sit with me at table. He may be me, said Father Brown, with cheerful contempt for grammar. He may be anybody else, answered Smail seriously. That is what I meant by what I said just now. You are the only man I feel sure is not the enemy. Father Brown again looked embarrassed, then he smiled and said, "Well, oddly enough, I'm not. What we have to consider is any chance of finding out if he really is here before he makes himself unpleasant." "There is one chance of finding out, I think," remarked the professor rather grimly. When we get to Southampton I shall take a car at once along the coast. I should be glad if you would come with me, but in the ordinary sense, of course, our little party will break up. If any one of them turns up again in that little churchyard on the Sussex coast, we shall know who he really is. The professor's program was duly carried out, at least to the extent of the car and its cargo in the form of Father Brown. They coasted along the road with the sea on one side and the hills of Hampshire and Sussex on the other, nor was there visible to the eye any shadow of pursuit. As they approached the village of Dulham only one man crossed their path who had any connection with the matter in hand, a journalist who had just visited the church and been courteously escorted by the vicar through the new excavated chapel, but his remarks and notes seemed to be of the ordinary newspaper sort. But Professor Smuggel was perhaps a little fanciful, and could not dismiss the sense of something odd and discouraging in the attitude and appearance of the man, who was tall and shabby, hook-nosed and hollow-eyed, with moustaches that drooped with depression. He seemed anything but enlivened by his late experiment as a sightseer. Indeed, he seemed to be striding as fast as possible from the sight, when they stopped him with a question. "It's all about a curse," he said, "a curse on the place, according to the guidebook or the parson, or the oldest inhabitant or whoever is the authority, and really, it feels jolly like it. Curse or curse, I'm glad to have got out of it." "Do you believe in curses?" asked Smuggel curiously. "I don't believe in anything, I'm a journalist," answered the melancholy being, Boone, of the Daily Wire. "But there's a something creepy about that crypt, and I'll never deny I felt a chill." And he strode on towards the railway station with a further accelerated pace. "Looks like a raven or a crow, that fellow," observed Smuggel as they turned towards the churchyard. "What is it they say about a bird of ill omen?" They entered the churchyard slowly, the eyes of the American antiquary lingering luxuriantly over the isolated roof of the Lych gate and the large unfathomable black growth of the yew looking like night itself defying the broad daylight. The path climbed up amid heaving levels of turf in which the gravestones were tilted at all angles like stone rafts tossed on a green sea, till it came to the ridge beyond which the great sea itself ran like an iron bar, with pale lights in it like steel. Almost at their feet the tough rank grass turned into a tuft of sea holly and ended in grey and yellow sand, and a foot or two from the holly, and outlined darkly against the steely sea, stood a motionless figure. But for its dark grey clothing it might almost have been the statue on some sepulchral monument. But Father Brown instantly recognized something in the elegant stoop of the shoulders and the rather sullen outward thrust of the short beard. "Gee!" exclaimed the professor of archaeology, "it's that man Tarrant, if you call him a man. Did you think, when I spoke on the boat, that I should ever get so quick an answer to my question?" "I thought you might get too many answers to it," answered Father Brown. "Why, how do you mean?" inquired the professor, darting a look at him over his shoulder. "I mean," answered the other mildly, "that I thought I heard voices behind the yew tree. I don't think Mr. Tarrant is so solitary as he looks, I might even venture to say, so solitary as he likes to look." Even as Tarrant turned slowly round in his moody manner, the confirmation came. Another voice, high and rather hard, but none the less feminine, was saying with experienced raillery. "And how was I to know he would be here?" It was borne in upon Professor Smuggel that this gay observation was not addressed to him, so he was forced to conclude in some bewilderment, that yet a third person was present. As Lady Diana Wales came out, radiant and resolute as ever, from the shadow of the yew, he noted grimly that she had a living shadow of her own. The lean dapper figure of Leonard Smith, that insinuating man of letters, appeared immediately behind her own flamboyant form, smiling, his head a little on one side like a dog's. "Snakes!" muttered Smuggel. "Why, they're all here. Or all except that little showman with the walrus whiskers." He heard Father Brown laughing softly beside him, and indeed the situation was becoming something more than laughable. It seemed to be turning topsy-turvy and tumbling about their ears like a pantomime trick, for even while the professor had been speaking, his words had received the most comical contradiction. The round head with the grotesque black crescent of moustache had appeared suddenly and seemingly out of a hole in the ground. An instant afterwards they realized that the hole was in fact a very large hole, leading to a ladder which descended into the bowels of the earth, that it was in fact the entrance to the subterranean scene they had come to visit. The little man had been the first to find the entrance and had already descended a rung or two of the ladder before he put his head out again to address his fellow travelers. He looked like some particularly preposterous grave digger in a burlesque of Hamlet. He only said thickly behind his thick moustaches, "It is down here." But it came to the rest of the company with a start of realization that, though they had sat opposite him at mealtimes for a week, they had hardly ever heard him speak before, and that though he was supposed to be an English lecturer, he spoke with a rather occult foreign accent. "You see, my dear professor," cried Lady Diana with trenchant cheerfulness, "your Byzantine mummy was simply too exciting to be missed. I simply had to come along and see it, and I'm sure the gentleman felt just the same. Now you must tell us all about it." "I do not know all about it," said the professor gravely, not to say grimly, "in some respects I don't even know what it's all about. It certainly seems odd that we should have all met again so soon, but I suppose there are no limits to the modern thirst for information. But if we are all to visit the place it must be done in a responsible way and, if you will forgive me, under responsible leadership. We must notify whoever is in charge of the excavations, we shall probably at least have to put our names in a book. Something rather like a wrangle followed on this collision between the impatience of the lady and the suspicions of the archaeologist, but the latter's insistence on the official rights of the vicar and the local investigation ultimately prevailed. The little man with the mustaches came reluctantly out of his grave again and silently acquiesced in a less impetuous descent. Fortunately, the clergyman himself appeared at this stage, a grey-haired, good-looking gentleman with a droop accentuated by doublet eyeglasses, and while rapidly establishing sympathetic relations with the professor as a fellow antiquarian, he did not seem to regard his rather motley group of companions with anything more hostile than amusement. "I hope you are none of you superstitious," he said pleasantly. "I ought to tell you, to start with, that there are supposed to be all sorts of bad omens and curses hanging over our devoted heads in this business. I have just been deciphering a Latin inscription which was found over the entrance to the chapel, and it would seem that there are no less than 3 curses involved, a curse for entering the sealed chamber, a double curse for opening the coffin, and a triple and most terrible curse for touching the gold relic found inside it. The 2 first maledictions I have already incurred myself," he added with a smile, "but I fear that even you will have to incur the first and mildest of them if you are to see anything at all. According to the story, the curses descend in a rather lingering fashion, at long intervals and on later occasions. I don't know whether that is any comfort to you." And the Reverend Mr. Walters smiled once more in his drooping and benevolent manner. "Story," repeated Professor Smuggel, "why, what story is that?" "It is rather a long story and varies, like other local legends," answered the vicar. "But it is undoubtedly contemporary with the time of the tomb, and the substance of it is embodied in the inscription and is roughly this: Guy de Geysers, a lord of the manor here early in the 13th century, had set his heart on a beautiful black horse in the possession of an envoy from Genoa, which that practical merchant prince would not sell except for a huge price. Guy was driven by avarice to the crime of pillaging the shrine and, according to one story, even killing the bishop, who was then resident there. Anyhow, the bishop uttered a curse which was to fall on anybody who should continue to withhold the gold cross from its resting place in his tomb, or should take steps to disturb it when it had returned there. The feudal lord raised the money for the horse by selling the gold relic to a goldsmith in the town, but on the first day he mounted the horse the animal reared and threw him in front of the church porch, breaking his neck. Meanwhile the goldsmith, hitherto wealthy and prosperous, was ruined by a series of inexplicable accidents, and fell into the power of a Jew moneylender living in the manor. Eventually the unfortunate goldsmith, faced with nothing but starvation, hanged himself on an apple tree. The gold cross with all his other goods, his house, shop, and tools, had long ago passed into the possession of the moneylender. Meanwhile, the son and heir of the feudal lord, shocked by the judgment on his blasphemous sire, had become a religious devotee in the dark and stern spirit of those times, and conceived it his duty to persecute all heresy and unbelief among his vassals. Thus the Jew, in his turn, who had been cynically tolerated by the father, was ruthlessly burnt by order of the son, so that he, in his turn, suffered for the possession of the relic, and after these 3 judgments, it was returned to the bishop's tomb, since when no eye has seen and no hand has touched it. Lady Diana Wales seemed to be more impressed than might have been expected. "It really gives one rather a shiver," she said, "to think that we are going to be the first, except the vicar." The pioneer with the big mustaches and the broken English did not descend after all by his favourite ladder, which indeed had only been used by some of the workmen conducting the excavation, for the clergyman led them round to a larger and more convenient entrance about 100 yards away, out of which he himself had just emerged from his investigations underground. Here the descent was by a fairly gradual slope with no difficulties save the increasing darkness, for they soon found themselves moving in single file down a tunnel as black as pitch, and it was some little time before they saw a glimmer of light ahead of them. Once during that silent march there was a sound like a catch in somebody's breath, it was impossible to say whose, and once there was an oath like a dull explosion, and it was in an unknown tongue. They came out in a circular chamber like a basilica in a ring of round arches, for that chapel had been built before the first pointed arch of the Gothic had pierced our civilization like a spear. A glimmer of greenish light between some of the pillars marked the place of the other opening into the world above, and gave a vague sense of being under the sea, which was intensified by 1 or 2 other incidental and perhaps fanciful resemblances. For the dog-tooth pattern of the Norman was faintly traceable round all the arches, giving them, above the cavernous darkness, something of the look of the mouths of monstrous sharks. And in the centre the dark bulk of the tomb itself, with its lifted lid of stone, might almost have been the jaws of some such leviathan. Whether out of the sense of fitness or from the lack of more modern appliances, the clerical antiquary had arranged for the illumination of the chapel only by 4 tall candles in big wooden candlesticks standing on the floor. Of these only one was alight when they entered, casting a faint glimmer over the mighty architectural forms. When they had all assembled, the clergyman proceeded to light the 3 others, and the appearance and contents of the great sarcophagus came more clearly into view. All eyes went first to the face of the dead, preserved across all those ages in the lines of life by some secret Eastern process, it was said, inherited from heathen antiquity and unknown to the simple graveyards of our own island. The professor could hardly repress an exclamation of wonder, for, though the face was as pale as a mask of wax, it looked otherwise like a sleeping man, who had but that moment closed his eyes. The face was of the ascetic, perhaps even the fanatical type, with a high framework of bones. The figure was clad in a golden cope and gorgeous vestments, and high up on the breast, at the base of the throat, glittered the famous gold cross upon a short gold chain, or rather necklace. The stone coffin had been opened by lifting the lid of it at the head and propping it aloft upon two strong wooden shafts or poles, hitched above under the edge of the upper slab and wedged below into the corners of the coffin behind the head of the corpse. Less could therefore be seen of the feet or the lower part of the figure, but the candle light shone full on the face, and in contrast with its tones of dead ivory the cross of gold seemed to stir and sparkle like a fire. Professor Smugle's big forehead had carried a big furrow of reflection, or possibly of worry, ever since the clergyman had told the story of the curse. But feminine intuition, not untouched by feminine hysteria, understood the meaning of his brooding immobility better than did the men around him. In the silence of that candle-lit cavern Lady Diana cried out suddenly. "Don't touch it, I tell you." But the man had already made one of his swift leonine movements, leaning forward over the body. The next instant they all darted, some forward and some backward, but all with a dreadful ducking motion as if the sky were falling. As the professor laid a finger on the gold cross, the wooden props, that bent very slightly in supporting the lifted lid of stone, seemed to jump and straighten themselves with a jerk. The lip of the stone slab slipped from its wooden perch, and in all their souls and stomachs came a sickening sense of down-rushing ruin, as if they had all been flung off a precipice. Smuggle had withdrawn his head swiftly, but not in time, and he lay senseless beside the coffin, in a red puddle of blood from scalp or skull. And the old stone coffin was once more closed as it had been for centuries, save that one or two sticks or splinters stuck in the crevice, horribly suggestive of bones crunched by an ogre. The Leviathan had snapped its jaws of stone. Lady Diana was looking at the wreck with eyes that had an electric glare as of lunacy, her red hair looked scarlet against the pallor of her face in the greenish twilight. Smith was looking at her, still with something dog-like in the turn of his head, but it was the expression of a dog who looks at a master whose catastrophe he can only partly understand. Tarrant and the foreigner had stiffened in their usual sullen attitudes, but their faces had turned the color of clay. The vicar seemed to have fainted. Father Brown was kneeling beside the fallen figure, trying to test its condition. Rather to the general surprise, the Byronic lounger, Paul Tarrant, came forward to help him. "He'd better be carried up into the air," he said. "I suppose there's just a chance for him." "He isn't dead," said Father Brown in a low voice, "but I think it's pretty bad. You aren't a doctor by any chance?" "No, but I've had to pick up a good many things in my time," said the other. "But never mind about me just now. My real profession would probably surprise you." "I don't think so," replied Father Brown, with a slight smile. "I thought of it about halfway through the voyage." "You are a detective shadowing somebody." "Well, the cross is safe from thieves now, anyhow." While they were speaking Tarrant had lifted the frail figure of the fallen man with easy strength and dexterity, and was carefully carrying him towards the exit. He answered over his shoulder. "Yes, the cross is safe enough." "You mean that nobody else is," replied Brown. "Are you thinking of the curse, too?" Father Brown went about for the next hour or two under a burden of frowning perplexity that was something beyond the shock of the tragic accident. He assisted in carrying the victim to the little inn opposite the church, interviewed the doctor, who reported the injury as serious and threatening, though not certainly fatal, and carried the news to the little group of travellers who had gathered round the table in the inn parlour. But wherever he went the cloud of mystification rested on him and seemed to grow darker the more deeply he pondered. For the central mystery was growing more and more mysterious, actually in proportion as many of the minor mysteries began to clear themselves up in his mind. Exactly in proportion as the meaning of individual figures in that motley group began to explain itself, the thing that had happened grew more and more difficult to explain. Leonard Smith had come merely because Lady Diana had come, and Lady Diana had come merely because she chose. They were engaged in one of those floating society flirtations that are all the more silly for being semi-intellectual. But the lady's romanticism had a superstitious side to it, and she was pretty well prostrated by the terrible end of her adventure. Paul Tarrant was a private detective, possibly watching the flirtation, for some wife or husband, possibly shadowing the foreign lecturer with the moustaches, who had much the air of an undesirable alien. But if he or anybody else had intended to steal the relic, the intention had been finally frustrated. And to all mortal appearance, what had frustrated it was either an incredible coincidence or the intervention of the ancient curse. As he stood in unusual perplexity in the middle of the village street, between the inn and the church, he felt a mild shock of surprise at seeing a recently familiar but rather unexpected figure advancing up the street. Mr. Boone, the journalist, looking very haggard in the sunshine, which showed up his shabby raiment like that of a scarecrow, had his dark and deep-set eyes, rather close together on either side of the long drooping nose, fixed on the priest. The latter looked twice before he realized that the heavy dark mustache hid something like a grin or at least a grim smile. "I thought you were going away," said Father Brown a little sharply. "I thought you left by that train 2 hours ago." "Well, you see I didn't," said Boone. Why have you come back? Asked the priest almost sternly. This is not the sort of little rural paradise for a journalist to leave in a hurry, replied the other. Things happen too fast here to make it worthwhile to go back to a dull place like London. Besides, they can't keep me out of the affair, I mean this second affair. It was I that found the body, or at any rate the clothes. Quite suspicious conduct on my part, wasn't it? Perhaps you think I wanted to dress up in his clothes. Shouldn't I make a lovely parson? And the lean and long-nosed mountebank suddenly made an extravagant gesture in the middle of the marketplace, stretching out his arms and spreading out his dark-gloved hands in a sort of burlesque benediction and saying, "Oh, my dear brethren and sisters, for I would embrace you all." "What on earth are you talking about?" cried Father Brown, and rapped the stones slightly with his stumpy umbrella, for he was a little less patient than usual. "Oh, you'll find out all about it if you ask that picnic party of yours at the inn," replied Boone scornfully. "That man Terence seems to suspect me merely because I found the clothes, though he only came up a minute too late to find them himself. But there are all sorts of mysteries in this business. The little man with the big mustaches may have more in him than meets the eye. For that matter, I don't see why you shouldn't have killed the poor fellow yourself." Father Brown did not seem in the least annoyed at the suggestion, but he seemed exceedingly bothered and bewildered by the remark. "Do you mean," he asked with simplicity, "that it was I who tried to kill Professor Smuggel?" "Not at all," said the other, waving his hand with the air of one making a handsome concession. "Plenty of dead people for you to choose among. Not limited to Professor Smuggel. Why, didn't you know somebody else had turned up, a good deal deader than Professor Smuggel? And I don't see why you shouldn't have done him in a quiet way. Religious differences, you know. Lamentable disunion of Christendom. I suppose you've always wanted to get the English parishes back." "I'm going back to the inn," said the priest quietly. "You say the people there know what you mean, and perhaps they may be able to say it." In truth, just afterwards his private perplexities suffered a momentary dispersal at the news of a new calamity. The moment he entered the little parlour where the rest of the company were collected, something in their pale faces told him they were shaken by something yet more recent than the accident at the tomb. Even as he entered, Leonard Smith was saying, "Where is all this going to end?" "It will never end, I tell you," repeated Lady Diana, gazing into vacancy with glassy eyes. "It will never end till we all end. One after another the curse will take us, perhaps slowly, as the poor vicar said, but it will take us all as it has taken him." "What in the world has happened now?" asked Father Brown. There was a silence, and then Terence said in a voice that sounded a little hollow. "Mr. Walters, the vicar, has committed suicide. I suppose it was the shock unhinged him. But I fear there can be no doubt about it. We've just found his black hat and clothes on a rock jutting out from the shore. He seems to have jumped into the sea. I thought he looked as if it had knocked him half-witted, and perhaps we ought to have looked after him, but there was so much to look after." "You could have done nothing," said the lady. "Don't you see the thing is dealing doom in a sort of dreadful order? The professor touched the cross, and he went first, the vicar had opened the tomb, and he went second, we only entered the chapel, and we—" "Hold on," said Father Brown, in a sharp voice he very seldom used, "this has got to stop." He still wore a heavy though unconscious frown, but in his eyes was no longer the cloud of mystification, but a light of almost terrible understanding. "What a fool I am!" he muttered. "I ought to have seen it long ago. The tale of the curse ought to have told me." "Do you mean to say," demanded Tarrant, "that we can really be killed now by something that happened in the 13th century?" Father Brown shook his head and answered with quiet emphasis. "I won't discuss whether we can be killed by something that happened in the 13th century, but I'm jolly certain that we can't be killed by something that never happened in the 13th century, something that never happened at all." "Well," said Tarrant, "it's refreshing to find a priest so skeptical of the supernatural as all that." "Not at all," replied the priest calmly, "it's not the supernatural part I doubt. It's the natural part. I'm exactly in the position of the man who said, I can believe the impossible, but not the improbable." "That's what you call a paradox, isn't it?" asked the other. "It's what I call common sense, properly understood," replied Father Brown. "It really is more natural to believe a preternatural story, that deals with things we don't understand, than a natural story that contradicts things we do understand. Tell me that the great Mr. Gladstone, in his last hours, was haunted by the ghost of Parnell, and I will be agnostic about it. But tell me that Mr. Gladstone, when first presented to Queen Victoria, wore his hat in her drawing room and slapped her on the back and offered her a cigar, and I am not agnostic at all. That is not impossible, it's only incredible. But I'm much more certain it didn't happen than that Parnell's ghost didn't appear, because it violates the laws of the world I do understand. So it is with that tale of the curse. It isn't the legend that I disbelieve, it's the history." Lady Diana had recovered a little from her trance of Cassandra, and her perennial curiosity about new things began to peer once more out of her bright and prominent eyes. "What a curious man you are!" she said. "Why should you disbelieve the history? I disbelieve the history because it isn't history, answered Father Brown. To anybody who happens to know a little about the Middle Ages, the whole story was about as probable as Gladstone offering Queen Victoria a cigar. But does anybody know anything about the Middle Ages? Do you know what a guild was? Have you ever heard of salvo wanagiosuo? Do you know what sort of people were servi regis? No, of course I don't, said the lady, rather crossly. What a lot of Latin words. No, of course, said Father Brown. If it had been Tutankhamun and a set of dried-up Africans preserved, heaven knows why, at the other end of the world, if it had been Babylonia or China, if it had been some race as remote and mysterious as the man in the moon, your newspapers would have told you all about it, down to the last discovery of a toothbrush or a collar stud. But the men who built your own parish churches, and gave the names to your own towns and trades, and the very roads you walk on, it has never occurred to you to know anything about them. I don't claim to know a lot myself, but I know enough to see that story is stuff and nonsense from beginning to end. It was illegal for a moneylender to dis-terrain on a man's shop and tools. It's exceedingly unlikely that the guild would not have saved a man from such utter ruin, especially if he were ruined by a Jew. Those people had vices and tragedies of their own, they sometimes tortured and burned people. But that idea of a man, without God or hope in the world, crawling away to die because nobody cared whether he lived, that isn't a medieval idea. That's a product of our economic science and progress. The Jew wouldn't have been a vassal of the feudal lord. The Jews normally had a special position as servants of the king. Above all, the Jew couldn't possibly have been burned for his religion. The paradoxes are multiplying, observed Tarrant, but surely you won't deny that Jews were persecuted in the Middle Ages. It would be near the truth, said Father Brown, to say they were the only people who weren't persecuted in the Middle Ages. If you want to satirize medievalism, you could make a good case by saying that some poor Christian might be burned alive for making a mistake about the homoousion, while a rich Jew might walk down the street openly sneering at Christ and the Mother of God. Well, that's what the story is like. It was never a story of the Middle Ages, it was never even a legend about the Middle Ages. It was made up by somebody whose notions came from novels and newspapers, and probably made up on the spur of the moment. The others seemed a little dazed by the historical digression, and seemed to wonder vaguely why the priest emphasized it and made it so important a part of the puzzle. But Tarrant, whose trade it was to pick the practical detail out of many tangles of digression, had suddenly become alert. His bearded chin was thrust forward farther than ever, but his sullen eyes were wide awake. Ah, he said, made up on the spur of the moment. Perhaps that is an exaggeration, admitted Father Brown calmly. I should rather say made up more casually and carelessly than the rest of an uncommonly careful plot. But the plotter did not think the details of medieval history would matter much to anybody. And his calculation in a general way was pretty nearly right, like most of his other calculations. Whose calculations? Who was right? Demanded the lady with a sudden passion of impatience. Who is this person you are talking about? Haven't we gone through enough, without your making our flesh creep with your he's and hims? I am talking about the murderer, said Father Brown. What murderer? She asked sharply. Do you mean that the poor professor was murdered? Well, said the staring Tarrant gruffly into his beard, we can't say murdered, for we don't know he's killed. The murderer killed somebody else, who was not Professor Smuggel, said the priest gravely. Why, whom else could he kill? Asked the other. He killed the Reverend John Walters, the vicar of Dulham, replied Father Brown with precision. He only wanted to kill those two, because they both had got hold of relics of one rare pattern. The murderer was a sort of monomaniac on the point. It all sounds very strange, muttered Tarrant. Of course we can't swear that the vicar's really dead either. We haven't seen his body. Oh yes, you have, said Father Brown. There was a silence as sudden as the stroke of a gong, a silence in which that subconscious guesswork that was so active and accurate in the woman moved her almost to a shriek. That is exactly what you have seen, went on the priest. You have seen his body. You haven't seen him, the real living man, but you have seen his body all right. You have stared at it hard by the light of 4 great candles, and it was not tossing suicidally in the sea but lying in state like a prince of the church in a shrine built before the crusade. In plain words, said Tarrant, you actually ask us to believe that the embalmed body was really the corpse of a murdered man. Father Brown was silent for a moment, then he said almost with an air of irrelevance. The first thing I noticed about it was the cross, or rather the string suspending the cross. Naturally, for most of you, it was only a string of beads and nothing else in particular, but, naturally also, it was rather more in my line than yours. You remember it lay close up to the chin, with only a few beads showing, as if the whole necklet were quite short. But the beads that showed were arranged in a special way, first 1 and then 3, and so on. In fact, I knew at a glance that it was a rosary, an ordinary rosary with a cross at the end of it. But a rosary has at least 5 decades and additional beads as well, and I naturally wondered where all the rest of it was. It would go much more than once round the old man's neck. I couldn't understand it at the time, and it was only afterwards I guessed where the extra length had gone to. It was coiled round and round the foot of the wooden prop that was fixed in the corner of the coffin, holding up the lid. So that when poor Smule merely plucked at the cross it jerked the prop out of its place and the lid fell on his skull like a club of stone. "By George!" said Tarrant, "I'm beginning to think there's something in what you say. This is a queer story if it's true." "When I realized that," went on Father Brown, "I could manage more or less to guess the rest. Remember, first of all, that there never was any responsible archaeological authority for anything more than investigation. Poor old Walters was an honest antiquary, who was engaged in opening the tomb to find out if there was any truth in the legend about embalmed bodies. The rest was all rumor, of the sort that often anticipates or exaggerates such finds. As a fact, he found the body had not been embalmed, but had fallen into dust long ago. Only while he was working there by the light of his lonely candle in that sunken chapel, the candle light threw another shadow that was not his own." "Ah!" cried Lady Diana with a catch in her breath, "and I know what you mean now. You mean to tell us we have met the murderer, talked and joked with the murderer, let him tell us a romantic tale, and let him depart untouched." "Leaving his clerical disguise on a rock," assented Brown. "It is all dreadfully simple. This man got ahead of the professor in the race to the churchyard and chapel, possibly while the professor was talking to that lugubrious journalist. He came on the old clergyman beside the empty coffin and killed him. Then he dressed himself in the black clothes from the corpse, wrapped it in an old cope which had been among the real finds of the exploration, and put it in the coffin, arranging the rosary and the wooden support as I have described. Then, having thus set the trap for his second enemy, he went up into the daylight and greeted us all with the most amiable politeness of a country clergyman." "He ran a considerable risk," objected Tarrant, "of somebody knowing Walters by sight." "I admit he was half mad," agreed Father Brown, "and I think you will admit that the risk was worth taking, for he has got off, after all." "I'll admit he was very lucky," growled Tarrant. "And who the devil was he?" "As you say, he was very lucky," answered Father Brown, "and not least in that respect. For that is the one thing we may never know." He frowned at the table for a moment and then went on, "This fellow has been hovering round and threatening for years, but the one thing he was careful of was to keep the secret of who he was, and he has kept it still. But if poor Smule recovers, as I think he will, it is pretty safe to say that you will hear more of it." "Why, what will Professor Smule do you think?" asked Lady Diana. "I should think the first thing he would do," said Tarrant, "would be to put the detectives on like dogs after this murdering devil. I should like to have a go at him myself." "Well," said Father Brown, smiling suddenly after his long fit of frowning perplexity, "I think I know the very first thing he ought to do." "And what is that?" asked Lady Diana with graceful eagerness. "He ought to apologize to all of you," said Father Brown. It was not upon this point, however, that Father Brown found himself talking to Professor Smule as he sat by the bedside during the slow convalescence of that eminent archaeologist. Nor, indeed, was it chiefly Father Brown who did the talking, for though the professor was limited to small doses of the stimulant of conversation, he concentrated most of it upon these interviews with his clerical friend. Father Brown had a talent for being silent in an encouraging way, and Smule was encouraged by it to talk about many strange things not always easy to talk about, such as the morbid phases of recovery and the monstrous dreams that often accompany delirium. It is often rather an unbalancing business to recover slowly from a bad knock on the head, and when the head is as interesting a head as that of Professor Smule, even its disturbances and distortions are apt to be original and curious. His dreams were like bold and big designs rather out of drawing, as they can be seen in the strong but stiff archaic arts that he had studied. They were full of strange saints with square and triangular halos, of golden outstanding crowns and glories round dark and flattened faces, of eagles out of the east and the high head dresses of bearded men with their hair bound like women. Only, as he told his friend, there was one much simpler and less entangled type, that continually recurred to his imaginative memory. Again and again all these Byzantine patterns would fade away like the fading gold on which they were traced as upon fire, and nothing remained but the dark bare wall of rock on which the shining shape of the fish was traced as with a finger dipped in the phosphorescence of fishes. For that was the sign which he once looked up and saw, in the moment when he first heard round the corner of the dark passage the voice of his enemy. "And at last," he said, "I think I have seen a meaning in the picture and the voice, and one that I never understood before. Why should I worry because one madman among a million of sane men, leagued in a great society against him, chooses to brag of persecuting me or pursuing me to death? The man who drew in the dark catacomb the secret symbol of Christ was persecuted in a very different fashion. He was the solitary madman, the whole sane society was leagued together not to save but to slay him. I have sometimes fussed and fidgeted and wondered whether this or that man was my persecutor, whether it was Tarrant, whether it was Leonard Smith, whether it was any one of them. Suppose it had been all of them? Suppose it had been all the men on the boat and the men on the train and the men in the village? Suppose, so far as I was concerned, they were all murderers. I thought I had a right to be alarmed because I was creeping through the bowels of the earth in the dark and there was a man who would destroy me. What would it have been like, if the destroyer had been up in the daylight and had owned all the earth and commanded all the armies and the crowds? How if he had been able to stop all the earths or smoke me out of my hole or kill me the moment I put my nose out in the daylight? What was it like to deal with murder on that scale? The world has forgotten these things, as until a little while ago it had forgotten war. Yes, said Father Brown, but the war came. The fish may be driven underground again, but it will come up into the daylight once more. As Saint Anthony of Padua humorously remarked, it is only fishes who survive the deluge.